My husband left me stranded at the airport during the worst blizzard of the decade. As he drove away to a celebration dinner, he told me to catch a cab because my chronic illness was too inconvenient for his big night. What he did not know was that I owned the car he was driving, the house he was returning to, and the company that was about to promote him. 7 days later, when I never came home, he asked my housekeeper where I had been. Her answer destroyed his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned your heartbreak into absolute justice. My name is Tiana. I am 35 years old, and I work as a senior forensic accountant for one of the most ruthless financial institutions in the country. Growing up in a hardworking African-American family on the south side of Chicago taught me how to read people, how to survive, and how to build an empire out of absolutely nothing. But apparently, it did not teach me how to read the man I had been married to for 6 years. The freezing wind whipped across the arrivals curb at O'Hare International Airport, cutting straight through my thin wool coat. I was trembling uncontrollably, not just from the negative 10-degree weather, but from a severe lupus flare-up that made my joints lock with excruciating, paralyzing pain. I had just flown back from a grueling 3-day audit in New York, and my body was completely shutting down. Julian, my husband, stood by the open trunk of our luxury SUV. Instead of reaching out to help me, instead of showing even a fraction of basic human decency, he grabbed my single suitcase and dropped it directly into the gray, freezing slush at my feet. "I am not missing my promotion dinner, just because you are throwing another one of your episodes," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom as he refused to even look me in the eye. "Take a cab and stop acting like a victim." I stood there frozen, paralyzed by the physical pain radiating through my bones and the sudden sheer cruelty of his words. This was the man who had stood at an altar and promised to be my partner in sickness and in health. Before I could even process what was happening, Julian slammed the trunk shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and sped off into the blinding white snow without looking back. As the red tail lights disappeared into the blizzard, I saw the distinct silhouette of another woman sitting in the passenger seat of his car. The car that I had secretly paid the down payment for. I did not fall to my knees. I did not scream or cry or cause a scene. I pulled out my phone with stiff, freezing fingers to call for a ride, only to see a text message light up my screen. It was from Chloe, Julian's white, terribly entitled sister-in-law, who was married to his older brother Jamal. The message read, "Julian told us you are faking sick again to ruin his big night. Do not bother coming to the family dinner, you are not wanted here anyway." Chloe had always hated me. She was the kind of woman who married into a successful black family and somehow thought she was superior to everyone in it. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, my neighborhood upbringing, and my career, dismissing my job as just crunching numbers. Jamal, Julian's brother, enabled her behavior completely, always taking her side and treating me like an outsider who had somehow tricked my way into their prestigious, status-obsessed world. They were a family that valued appearances over authenticity, wealth over character, and Julian had slowly morphed into an exact replica of his arrogant brother. Instead of breaking down on the curb, a cold, calculating calm washed over my entire body, the kind of calm that only comes when a woman realizes she has absolutely nothing left to lose. I dialed a private black car service, a corporate perk of my highly confidential job handling multi-million-dollar audits. When the driver asked for my destination, I did not give him the address to the sprawling suburban estate I shared with Julian. I gave him the address to a luxury downtown penthouse, a property I owned completely through a blind trust that my husband knew absolutely nothing about. During the 40-minute ride into the city, my body slowly began to thaw in the heated leather back seat, but my heart turned completely to ice. My phone buzzed in my purse. Julian had sent a picture to our family group chat. It showed him sitting at a high-end steakhouse flanked by his brother Jamal and Chloe, holding up a glass of expensive champagne. The caption read, "Hope the cab was not too expensive, grow up." They were all in on it. They all viewed me as a burden. They thought I was weak because my illness sometimes kept me in bed for days. They thought I was financially dependent because I dressed modestly, drove an older sedan to blend in, and let Julian manage the public face of our finances to stroke his fragile ego. They genuinely believed I was just a quiet, unassuming wife who was lucky to be married to a rising corporate star. They had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. I had been investing silently in tech startups and commercial real estate for over a decade. I had amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed Julian's entire corporate salary, but I kept it hidden because I valued peace and privacy over flashy displays of wealth. I wanted a marriage based on love, not financial leverage. But looking at that photo of them toasting to my abandonment, I realized my humility had been a massive mistake. When I arrived at my penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, breathtaking view of the frozen Chicago skyline. I ignored the beautiful scenery, poured myself a glass of water, opened my encrypted laptop, and accessed the live feed of the security cameras I had secretly installed in my suburban home 3 months prior. I had placed them there when I first noticed strange discrepancies in Julian's corporate logistics accounts, suspecting he might be bringing dangerous work trouble into our home. I never expected the trouble to be his personal life. I watched the screen intently. I expected to see Julian return home alone after his celebratory dinner. Instead, the front door swung open and Julian walked in with Valerie, a junior marketing manager from his firm. She was laughing loudly, slipping off her designer heels, and walking straight into my kitchen as if she owned the place. I watched in absolute silence as Valerie opened my cabinets, poured herself a glass of my expensive red wine, and walked into the master bedroom to drape my silk robe over her shoulders. Julian wrapped his arms around her waist, kissing her neck deeply. He actually laughed as he told her how pathetic I looked, shivering on the airport curb. She giggled, calling me dead weight and saying he deserved a real woman who could keep up with his lifestyle. The sheer audacity of watching another woman in my home wearing my clothes and mocking my chronic illness, while my husband agreed with her, extinguished any lingering shred of love I had left for him. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse watching the man I had devoted 6 years of my life to completely betray our vows without a single ounce of hesitation. I thought about all the times I had nursed him through the flu, all the times I had quietly paid off his credit card debt before we got married, all the times I had smiled politely while Chloe made underhanded comments at family barbecues. I had shrunk myself to make him feel bigger, and this was my reward. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop. It was a high-priority automated fraud alert from my primary banking institution. Julian was currently attempting to wire $150,000 from our joint savings account to an offshore holding company. He was draining our liquid assets right in front of me, likely to fund a new life with Valerie, or cover up whatever mess he had gotten himself into at work. I thought because my name was not on the primary login dashboard, I would not get notified until the morning. But I am a forensic accountant. Finding hidden money is what I do for a living. Moving it is even easier. Within 30 seconds, utilizing my professional security clearances and private wealth management portals, I executed a series of financial maneuvers that would leave him completely paralyzed. First, I froze the joint account indefinitely, citing suspicious offshore activity, trapping the remaining balance where he could not touch a single cent. Second, I transferred all of my personal assets, properties, and silent investments into an impenetrable blind trust that no divorce lawyer could ever crack. Finally, I locked his access to every single credit line tied to my name, which unfortunately for him was absolutely all of them. He had terrible credit when we met, and I had co-signed for everything, including his precious luxury SUV. 10 minutes later, the security feed showed Julian standing in the kitchen staring at his phone in a state of absolute breathless panic. He had just tried to order a ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne for Valerie using a premium delivery app, and his card had been declined. He tried a second card. Declined. He tried a third. Declined. He paced back and forth, running a hand over his face while Valerie watched him from the kitchen island, her smile fading into confusion. He logged into his laptop on the kitchen counter, frantically typing in passwords, only to be met with big red error messages, locking him out of every financial safety net he thought he had. My phone lit up with a furious text message from him. "Where the hell is my money, Tiana? What did you do to the accounts? Answer me right now. I read the message, took a slow sip of my hot water, and turned my phone completely off. I was not going to argue with him. I was not going to beg for an explanation or demand an apology. I was going to disappear. I was going to let the crushing, deafening silence do the talking while I methodically dismantled his entire existence piece by piece. He wanted me out of his way so badly. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. 7 days of total absence, while I prepared the greatest financial and personal ambush he would ever face. I sat in the dark of my penthouse, listening to the howling wind of the blizzard outside, feeling an overwhelming sense of clarity. For years I had compromised my own peace to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I had tolerated Jamal's arrogance and Chloe's microaggressions because I believed that family required sacrifice. But watching Julian frantically scramble in our kitchen, his true character exposed by a few frozen bank accounts, I realized that my sacrifice had only enabled his cruelty. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving the city buried under 2 feet of snow. I powered on my secondary encrypted phone and immediately placed a call to Miss Cora, the older African-American woman who managed our household. Miss Cora had worked for Julian's family for decades, but she and I shared a special bond. She reminded me of my own grandmother, and she saw right through the pretentious facade that Julian and his brother put on for society. I knew Julian treated her like invisible help, ignoring her presence while she dusted the shelves and polished the floors. That was his fatal mistake. To a forensic accountant, an invisible person inside the target's house is the ultimate asset. When Miss Cora answered, I did not waste time on pleasantries. I told her exactly what happened at the airport, what I had seen on the cameras, and what I needed her to do. I expected her to be shocked, perhaps hesitant to get involved in marital drama. Instead, she let out a low, knowing chuckle. I knew that boy was no good the day he stopped looking you in the eye, she said, her voice steady and resolute. What do you need me to find, baby? I needed the physical ledgers. The digital breadcrumbs I was already tracking from my laptop indicated that Julian and Jamal were running a massive embezzlement scheme through their logistics firm, using fake minority-owned vendors to siphon millions. But the digital trail was not enough to put them away. I needed the hard copies, the handwritten notes, the physical proof that I knew Julian kept locked inside his biometric safe in his home office. Miss Cora agreed to keep her eyes open, to play the role of the subservient silent housekeeper while gathering the intelligence I needed to bring their entire operation to the ground. As the first day of my absence drew to a close, I watched the camera feed as Julian finally realized I was not coming home. He did not look worried. He looked annoyed. He texted my phone one more time, a message I read on my synced laptop. Stop acting like a child and turn your phone on. Valerie had left before dawn, and Julian was now pacing the living room, trying to figure out how to unfreeze the accounts without admitting to the bank that he had been trying to wire money offshore. He had absolutely no idea the storm that was coming for him. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the cold, calculated justice I was preparing to deliver. The first 24 hours of my silence set the perfect stage for Julian to reveal exactly who he was. I woke up the next morning in the temperature-controlled sanctuary of my downtown penthouse. The severe joint pain from my lupus flare-up had already begun to subside, aided by the high-end heated mattress pad and the simple fact that I was no longer sharing a breathing space with a toxic man. I brewed a cup of green tea, opened my laptop, and pulled up the centralized dashboard of the hidden cameras I had discreetly installed throughout our suburban home. Julian was pacing this kitchen island, his phone pressed hard against his ear. I turned up the audio feed just in time to hear him screaming at a bank customer service representative. He was demanding they override the freeze on our joint savings account, claiming his wife was having a severe mental health crisis and had locked the funds by mistake. The representative politely informed him that he was not an authorized signer on the newly formed trust and that his access was permanently revoked. Julian slammed his fist onto the marble countertop and hurled his phone across the room, shattering the screen against the stainless steel refrigerator. He never once called local hospitals to see if the blizzard had put me in the emergency room. He never called the highway patrol to see if my cab had run off the icy roads. His only concern was the sudden terrifying realization that he had lost access to my money. Later that afternoon, I intercepted a phone call between Julian and his older brother Jamal. The audio was crystal clear through the living room camera. Julian paced back and forth, complaining that I was throwing a pathetic tantrum just to ruin his upcoming promotion. Jamal laughed, a deep and arrogant sound that echoed through the empty house. Jamal told Julian to relax, insisting that I was probably shivering in a cheap motel and would come crawling back the moment my credit cards declined. They spoke about my chronic illness, as if it were a convenient punchline, agreeing that my weak immune system would force me to return home, begging for warmth. Jamal then suggested he and his wife Chloe come over the next day to help Julian clean up the house and prepare for the corporate brunch Julian was hosting to secure his new vice president title. Julian eagerly agreed, telling his brother that he wanted all traces of my clutter removed before his bosses arrived. Day 2 began with the deafening crunch of snowplows clearing the suburban streets outside my marital home. I sat at my sleek glass dining table in the penthouse, my fingers flying across my keyboard as I monitored the external driveway cameras. Jamal's silver Mercedes pulled up right on schedule. Chloe stepped out of the passenger side, dressed head to toe in designer winter athletic wear, holding 2 iced coffees. She strutted up the front walkway with an air of absolute entitlement, acting as though she were the new lady of the manor. Julian opened the front door, looking disheveled and frantic. Chloe breezed past him without a word of comfort, heading straight for my kitchen. I switched my screen to the primary kitchen camera and watched in cold, calculated silence. Chloe set her coffee down and immediately opened the large walk-in pantry. She did not grab a trash bag. She grabbed heavy-duty contractor bags from the garage. She marched over to my stove and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out my late grandmother's seasoned cast-iron skillets. These were not just kitchen tools. They were family heirlooms heavy with decades of history, love, and survival passed down through 3 generations of Black women in my family. Chloe lifted them with a look of pure disgust, holding them away from her designer jacket, and dropped them unceremoniously into the black plastic bag. The heavy thud of the metal hitting the floor echoed through my laptop speakers. She then moved to the living room, and I switched my camera feed to follow her. Jamal was lounging on my custom velvet sofa, sipping a beer he had taken from my private reserve. Chloe stood in the center of the room, her hands on her hips, scrutinizing the walls. I had spent years curating a stunning collection of original artwork by emerging Black artists, beautiful, vibrant portraits and abstract pieces that celebrated our culture and history. Chloe walked up to a stunning canvas that depicted a woman with a magnificent afro woven from gold leaf. She ripped it right off the wall. She tossed the canvas onto the hardwood floor and turned to her husband with a sneer that contorted her entire face. "Good riddance," she said, her voice dripping with venomous privilege. "I always told Julian she was too ghetto for this neighborhood. She never fit in with our crowd anyway. All this ethnic junk just brings down the property value." Jamal simply laughed, nodding in agreement as he set his beer down. He stood up, stretched lazily, and walked over to help his wife dismantle my heritage. Together they ripped down the rest of my art collection, shoving the expensive frames and delicate canvases into the heavy-duty garbage bags. They carried the bags out the front door and dragged them to the snowy curb like common household waste. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear over the skillets or the paintings. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the video feed. I clipped and saved the audio file of her racist, classist remarks to a secure cloud server. Every single action they took, every piece of property they destroyed, was just adding another zero to the financial devastation I was meticulously preparing for them. As a forensic accountant, I knew better than to react to emotional provocation. I simply gathered the evidence. While Chloe and Jamal were busy desecrating my living room, Julian retreated to his home office. I quickly toggled my dashboard to the hidden microcamera I had installed directly above his massive mahogany desk. The overhead angle gave me a perfect, unobstructed bird's-eye view of his workspace. Julian locked the office door behind him, a paranoid habit he had developed over the last few months. He unlocked his bottom desk drawer with a small physical key and pulled out a thick manila folder. He spread the documents out across the dark wood surface, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through the pages. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, tapping the digital enhancement tool to sharpen the video resolution. As the text came into crisp, focus, my analytical instincts kicked into high gear. This was not a divorce petition. This was not a real estate contract. It was an official incorporation document for a commercial logistics company. I scanned the paragraphs rapidly, reading the terms of a massive corporate loan application tied to this new shell entity. The numbers printed on the page were staggering, far exceeding any legitimate business venture Julian could afford on his salary. He was establishing a fake vendor network right in the middle of his own firm's supply chain. But it was the bottom of the final page that made the blood freeze in my veins. I zoomed in tightly on the signature line designated for the primary financial guarantor. There, sitting stark and black against the white paper, was my name. It was a near-perfect forgery of my signature. Julian was not just cheating on me with a junior marketing manager. He and his brother were not just throwing away my belongings to prepare the house for a new woman. They were actively orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme, and Julian had forged my signature to make me the primary financial shield for their crimes. If their company auditors ever caught on to the missing millions, the federal paper trail would lead directly to my bank accounts, my assets, and my name. He was setting me up to take the fall and go to federal prison so he and Jamal could walk away filthy rich. I sat back in my plush leather chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the dark penthouse. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Julian thought he was dealing with a sick, emotional wife who would cry over discarded paintings and a ruined marriage. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed a loaded gun to a woman who dismantled corporate fraud networks for a living. The gloves were officially off. Day 3 broke with a pale, freezing sunlight over the Chicago skyline. I woke up with 0 tears left to shed. The shock of being left to freeze at the airport, and the heartbreak of watching my marriage dissolve on a security feed, had completely metabolized into pure cold focus. I walked into the kitchen of my penthouse, brewed a pot of black coffee, and carried it to my expansive glass dining table. I opened my laptop and connected it to 3 high-resolution monitors I kept for major audits. I was no longer a betrayed wife. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I was going to war. I bypassed our personal banking portals entirely. Julian thought he was clever by locking me out of the joint accounts, but those accounts were pocket change compared to the corporate funds he managed. Using my top-tier security clearances and advanced financial tracking software, I dove straight into the public and private corporate registries of Julian and Jamal's logistics firm. I cross-referenced the shell company name I had magnified from the security footage in his home office. It took me less than 4 hours to follow the bloody money trail. I uncovered a massive systematic fraud network buried deep within their supply chain. Over the past 14 months, Julian and his brother Jamal had been authorizing exorbitant payments to a web of phantom minority-owned vendors. These companies had no physical addresses, no operational history, and no employees. They existed only on paper. Julian and Jamal were using these fake invoices to siphon money directly from their parent company. I ran the calculations. The total amount embezzled came out to exactly $4.2 million. But the sheer breathtaking evil of their plan did not hit me until I traced the routing numbers attached to those phantom vendors. The fraudulent payments were not landing in accounts controlled by Julian or Jamal. They were bouncing through a series of offshore holding companies and finally landing in a master account registered under my name, using my social security number, backed by the forged signature I had seen on his desk. Julian was not just stealing. He was setting me up as the ultimate fall guy. If the federal authorities or the corporate compliance auditors ever caught on to the missing millions, the entire digital paper trail would lead directly to me. Julian would play the innocent, heartbroken husband whose manipulative, financially savvy wife had used her accounting skills to bleed his company dry. I was perfectly willing to send me to federal prison so he and his arrogant brother could walk away filthy rich. By day 4, the hidden cameras in my house revealed a man whose perfect plan was beginning to fracture. Julian was visibly sweating. My financial lockdown had frozen his access to the illicit funds he needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle. I watched Valerie storm into the kitchen, throwing her designer handbag onto the counter. She complained loudly that Julian had promised her a luxury shopping spree on the Magnificent Mile, but his credit cards were still declining everywhere they went. Julian snapped at her, his voice echoing through the empty house, telling her to back off and give him a few days to fix a banking error. The cracks in his arrogant facade were showing, but I knew digital evidence alone could be contested in court. High-priced defense lawyers could claim Julian was hacked or that I had planted the electronic files myself. I needed physical proof. I needed the handwritten black ledger. I knew Julian kept locked inside the biometric wall safe behind the bookshelf in his home office. I had watched him put it in there dozens of times, bragging about how he liked to keep hard copies of his most sensitive logistics contacts. But I could not step foot inside that house to get it, and trying to hire a private investigator on short notice would leave a paper trail. I had to activate my only inside ally. On the morning of day 5, I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Miss Cora had worked for Julian's family since he was a teenager. When I married him and moved in, she was the only person in that entire circle who treated me with genuine warmth and respect. She reminded me of my own grandmother, possessing that quiet, observant wisdom that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated. Julian and Chloe treated her like invisible help, ignoring her presence while she cleaned up their messes. That was their fatal mistake. To a forensic accountant, an invisible person inside the target's house is the ultimate asset. When Miss Cora answered, I did not waste time on pleasantries. I told her exactly what happened at the airport. I told her about Valerie sleeping in my bed, about Chloe throwing away my black art collection, and about the forged signatures setting me up for federal fraud. I expected her to gasp or express hesitation about getting involved in a legal mess. Instead, she let out a low, knowing sound of disgust. I knew that boy was rotten the day he stopped looking you in the eye, Miss Cora said, her voice steady and completely resolute. He has been pacing around this house like a caged rat, barking orders and acting a fool with that little girl he brought in here. What do you need me to do, Maya? I told her about the biometric safe in the home office. Julian believed it was impenetrable because it required his thumbprint. What he did not know was that I had been the one to purchase and install that safe 3 years ago when we renovated the room. I had programmed a master bypass code directly into the keypad's internal motherboard for emergency access, a code I had never shared with him. I recited the 6-digit sequence to Miss Cora and told her I needed clear photographs of every single page inside the black ledger. Miss Cora agreed without a second of hesitation. She told me she would wait until nightfall, playing the role of the subservient silent housekeeper until the house was entirely asleep. Day 6 brought a new level of audacity from my husband. I was drinking my morning tea when my phone alerted me to a local news broadcast. I opened the live stream and nearly dropped my mug. Julian was standing on our snow-covered front porch, surrounded by local news reporters and microphones. He was wearing a tasteful dark winter coat, looking directly into the camera with tears pooling in his eyes. He put on a masterful, sickening performance of a devastated husband. He told the reporters that my chronic illness had triggered a severe mental health crisis. He claimed that I had become confused during the blizzard, wandered away from the airport, and had been missing for almost a week. He pleaded with the public to help find his beloved wife, wiping a perfectly timed tear from his cheek. I was actively using my disappearance to garner public sympathy right before his company announced his promotion to vice president. He was painting me as a fragile, mentally unstable woman to control the narrative before the authorities ever thought to look into his finances. That night, my secure server chimed with incoming files. Miss Cora had successfully accessed the safe. Dozens of high-resolution images flooded my screen. It was all there. Handwritten dates, routing numbers off book transfer logs, and the exact names of the fake minority-owned vendors he and Jamal had fabricated. The physical proof of the $4.2 million embezzlement was now completely in my hands. The final nail in his coffin had been secured. As I was downloading the files to a secure external drive, my phone lit up with a text message from Miss Cora. It was a chilling update that made my blood run cold. Hi is hosting a fancy catered brunch here tomorrow morning, she typed. His corporate bosses are coming along with Jamal and Chloe. He wants to show them how brave he is being through this tragedy. But that is not all. I just heard him on the phone with his lawyer. He is bringing the police to the house during the brunch. He is filing the paperwork to officially declare you mentally incompetent and a danger to yourself. I is going to use the police report to forcefully seize control of your remaining assets and the blind trust. It is time, Maya. I read the message twice, the glow of the screen illuminating my calm, unwavering expression. Julian wanted to play games with my freedom, my mind, and my money in front of his corporate bosses. He wanted an audience. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking over to my closet to select the sharpest, most powerful designer suit I owned. He was going to get exactly the audience he asked for. Day 3 broke with a pale, freezing sunlight reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I woke up feeling completely different than the woman who had shivered on the airport curb just 48 hours ago. The shock of abandonment and the visceral sting of watching another woman parade around in my silk robe had entirely evaporated. In their place was a terrifyingly calm, absolute focus. I walked into my pristine kitchen, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and carried it over to my expansive glass dining table. I opened my encrypted laptop and powered on the 3 high-resolution monitors I kept for major corporate audits. I was no longer a betrayed wife mourning a dead marriage. I was a senior forensic accountant and I was going to war. Julian thought he had dealt me a crippling blow when he tried to drain our joint savings. He genuinely believed that locking me out of those accounts would leave me stranded, desperate, and begging for his financial mercy. But that joint account held mere pennies compared to the corporate wealth I managed daily, and it was absolutely nothing compared to my private investments. By focusing on the personal funds Julian had shown his hand, he was scrambling for liquidity. I decided it was time to find out exactly why. Using my top-tier security clearances and a suite of advanced financial tracking software that cost more than Julian's luxury SUV, I bypassed our personal banking portals entirely and drove straight into the public and private corporate registries. Julian and his brother Jamal ran the supply chain division for a massive international logistics firm. It was a high-pressure, high-yield environment where millions of dollars in vendor contracts shifted hands every single quarter. I cross-referenced the shell company name I had magnified from the security footage in his home office against the firm's active vendor registry. It took me less than 4 hours to follow the bloody money trail. I did not need to guess or speculate. I simply let the numbers tell me the story, and the story they told was staggering. I uncovered a massive systematic fraud network buried deep within their corporate supply chain. Over the past 14 months, Julian and Jamal had been authorizing exorbitant expedited payments to a web of phantom companies. They had specifically registered these shell entities as minority-owned vendors, exploiting their parent company diversity and inclusion initiatives to bypass standard auditing protocols. It was a brilliant, despicable manipulation of a system designed to help people who actually looked like us. These companies had no physical office addresses, no operational history, no freight trucks, and 0 employees. They existed purely on paper, generating fake invoices for logistical consulting and administrative warehousing fees. I ran the calculations, watching the spreadsheet populate with red flags. The total amount they had embezzled came out to exactly $4.2 million. But the sheer breathtaking evil of their plan did not fully hit me until I traced the routing numbers attached to those phantom vendors. When you steal $4 million, you have to clean it. You have to wash the money before it can buy you steak dinners, diamond necklaces for your mistress, or luxury vehicles. I tracked the fraudulent payments as they bounced through a series of offshore holding companies, moving from the Cayman Islands to Delaware, fracturing into dozens of smaller, unassuming deposits. I followed the final routing sequence to its ultimate destination. The money was not landing in accounts controlled by Julian. It was not landing in accounts controlled by Jamal. The stolen funds were funneling directly into a master account registered under my name, tied to my social security number, and backed by the forged signature I had seen on his desk. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian was not just stealing from his company, he was meticulously, intentionally setting me up as the ultimate fall guy. If the federal authorities or the corporate compliance auditors ever caught on to the missing millions, the entire digital paper trail would lead directly to my bank accounts and my professional credentials. I could see his exact defense strategy unfolding in my mind. If the FBI kicked down our door, Julian would play the innocent, heartbroken husband. He would claim that his manipulative, financially savvy wife had used her accounting skills to bleed his company dry right under his nose. He would point to my independent wealth, which he was just now trying to uncover as proof of my illicit activities. I was perfectly willing to send me to a federal penitentiary so he and his arrogant brother could walk away filthy rich and completely blameless. By day 4, the hidden cameras in my house revealed a man whose perfect plan was beginning to fracture under the weight of his own greed. Julian was visibly sweating. My immediate financial lockdown had frozen his access to the illicit funds he needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle and keep his mistress happy. I watched Valerie storm into the kitchen, throwing her designer handbag onto the marble counter. She complained loudly that Julian had promised her a luxury shopping spree on the Magnificent Mile, but his credit cards were still declining everywhere they went. Julian snapped at her, his voice echoing through the empty house, telling her to back off and give him a few days to fix a banking error. The cracks in his arrogant facade were showing. He spent hours pacing the living room, drinking heavily, and making hushed, frantic phone calls to Jamal. They were panicked because the corporate compliance audit was approaching, and they needed to move the stolen funds to cover their tracks. But because I had locked the accounts, their money was trapped in a digital purgatory they could not access without triggering a massive federal red flag. I sat back in my chair and stared at the monitors. I had the digital evidence. I had the routing numbers, the fake incorporation documents, and the screenshots of the forged signatures. But as a professional, I knew that digital evidence alone could be fiercely contested in a court of law. High-priced defense lawyers could claim Julian was hacked. They could argue that my system access proved I was the one manipulating the files. They could say the video of his desk was circumstantial. I needed physical proof. I needed the undeniable handwritten documentation of their crimes. I needed the black leather ledger I knew Julian kept locked inside the biometric wall safe behind the bookshelf in his home office. I had watched him put it in there dozens of times, bragging to Jamal about how he liked to keep hard copies of his most sensitive logistics contacts offline, away from the eyes of corporate IT. That ledger contained the handwritten dates, the exact transaction amounts, and the passwords to the offshore accounts. It was the smoking gun that would tie Julian to the fraud beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. But I could not step foot inside that house to get it. If Julian saw me, he would immediately call the police and execute his plan to have me committed. Trying to hire a private investigator to break in on such short notice was too risky and would leave a dangerous paper trail. I stared at the live feed of the home office, focusing on the heavy bookshelf hiding the safe. Julian believed that safe was impenetrable because it required his specific thumbprint to open. What my arrogant husband did not know was that I had been the one to research, purchase, and install that exact model of safe 3 years ago when we renovated the room. And because I never trust a single point of failure, I had programmed a master bypass code directly into the keypad's internal motherboard for emergency access. A 6-digit sequence I had never shared with him. I had the code. I just needed a pair of hands inside the house to type it in. I picked up my encrypted phone and scrolled through my contacts. There was only one person in that house who Julian treated as completely invisible. One person who had the access, the discretion, and the loyalty to pull this off. I was going to have to activate my only inside ally. On the morning of the 5th day, I picked up my secondary encrypted phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. The digital trail I had uncovered was damning, but I needed the physical ledger locked inside Julian's home office safe to guarantee a federal indictment. I could not risk hiring a private investigator, and I certainly could not walk through the front door myself. I needed someone who already had full access to the house, someone completely invisible to my arrogant husband. I needed Miss Cora. Miss Cora was the older African-American housekeeper who had worked for Julian's family since he was a teenager. When I married him and moved into that sprawling suburban house, she was the only person in his entire circle who treated me with genuine warmth. She reminded me of my own grandmother, possessing that quiet, observant wisdom that comes from a lifetime of watching arrogant people make foolish mistakes. Julian treated her like a piece of the furniture, barking orders without making eye contact and ignoring her presence while she polished the floors and cleaned up his messes. Chloe was even worse, frequently snapping at Miss Cora to fetch her water while she lounged on my sofa. They both believed she was just simple help. That was their fatal error. To a forensic accountant building a fraud case, an invisible person inside the target location is the ultimate asset. When Miss Cora answered the phone, I did not waste time on pleasantries. I told her exactly what had happened at the airport during the blizzard. I told her about Valerie sleeping in my bed, about Chloe throwing away my black art collection, and about the forged signatures routing stolen corporate funds into my name. I expected her to gasp or express hesitation about getting involved in a dangerous legal mess. Instead, she let out a low, knowing sound of absolute disgust. "I knew that boy was rotten the day he stopped looking you in the eye," Miss Cora said, her voice steady and resolute. "He has been pacing around this house like a caged rat, barking orders, and acting a fool with that little girl he brought in here. What do you need me to do, Maya?" I told her about the biometric safe, hidden behind the heavy oak bookshelf in Julian's home office. Julian believed that safe was impenetrable because it required his specific thumbprint to open. What my husband did not know was that I had been the one to research, purchase, and oversee the installation of that exact model 3 years ago during a room renovation. Because I never trust a single point of failure in any security system, I had programmed a master bypass code directly into the keypad's internal motherboard for emergency access. It was a 6-digit sequence I had never shared with him. I recited the numbers to Miss Cora and told her I needed clear, well-lit photographs of every single page inside the black leather ledger kept on the bottom shelf. Miss Cora agreed without a second of hesitation. She told me she would wait until nightfall, playing her role perfectly until the house was entirely asleep. Day 6 brought a new sickening level of audacity from my husband. I was drinking my morning tea when my phone alerted me to a breaking local news broadcast. I opened the live stream and nearly dropped my mug. Julian was standing on our snow-covered front porch, surrounded by local news reporters and heavy camera equipment. He was wearing a tasteful dark winter coat, looking directly into the news lenses with tears pooling in his eyes. He put on a masterful, deeply disturbing performance of a devastated husband. He told the reporters that my chronic illness had recently triggered a severe mental health crisis. He claimed with a trembling voice that my lupus had affected my cognitive functions, causing me to become confused during the blizzard, wander away from the airport terminal, and disappear into the storm. He pleaded with the public to help find his beloved wife, wiping a perfectly timed tear from his cheek. My blood ran completely cold. He was actively weaponizing my physical illness to build a false narrative about my mental stability. He was using my disappearance to garner massive public sympathy right before his company announced his promotion to vice president. He was painting me as a fragile, mentally incompetent woman to control the story before the authorities ever thought to look into his finances. The sheer calculation of it was breathtaking. I was laying the legal groundwork to seize my assets while playing the tragic hero on morning television. That night, the glowing screen of my laptop was the only light in the penthouse. My secure server chimed with a notification of incoming encrypted files. Miss Cora had successfully accessed the safe. Dozens of high-resolution images flooded my monitor. I opened the first file and felt a fierce wave of triumph. It was all there. Julian's arrogant, sloppy handwriting detailed every single transaction. I scrolled through the images of the ledger pages. He had documented the handwritten dates, the exact routing numbers, the off-book transfer logs, and the specific names of the fake minority-owned vendors he and Jamal had fabricated. He even had a column tracking the percentage cuts he and his brother were taking from the $4.2 million theft. He had literally written down the physical proof of his own federal crimes and locked it in the box he thought only he could open. The digital trail I had uncovered was now backed by undeniable physical documentation. The final nail in his coffin had been perfectly secured. As I was downloading the files to a secure external hard drive, my phone lit up with a text message from Miss Cora. It was a chilling update that verified exactly what I had suspected when I watched his news interview. "Hi is hosting a fancy catered brunch here tomorrow morning," she typed. "His corporate bosses are coming along with Jamal and Chloe. He wants to show the executives how brave and dedicated he is being through this family tragedy." But that is not all. I just heard him on the phone with his lawyer. He is bringing the police and a medical proxy attorney to the house during the brunch. He is filing the emergency paperwork to officially declare you mentally incompetent and a danger to yourself. Hai is going to use the police report to forcefully seize control of your remaining assets and your investment trust. It is time, Maya. I read the message twice. The cool blue light of the screen, illuminating my calm, unwavering expression. Julian wanted to play games with my freedom, my mind, and my money in front of his corporate bosses. He wanted to use my life as a stepping stone for his career while stealing the wealth I had built. He wanted an audience to witness his tragic performance. I closed my laptop and stood up, the silence of the penthouse wrapping around me like armor. I walked over to my expansive walk-in closet and began sifting through the garments. I bypassed the modest, unassuming clothes I usually wore to blend into his suburban lifestyle. I selected a razor-sharp tailored designer suit in a deep, commanding shade of emerald green. I paired it with pristine stiletto heels that echoed with authority. Julian was about to get exactly the audience he asked for, but the show he was going to get would destroy him completely. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of expensive catered bacon and freshly brewed artisan coffee. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, playing his part to absolute perfection. He had just finished dabbing the corners of his eyes with a linen napkin, recounting a fabricated story to his corporate bosses about how much he missed my presence in the house. He was laying the foundation for his tragic hero narrative, preparing to leverage my supposed mental breakdown into a fast-tracked promotion to vice president. He leaned back in his chair, exuding arrogant confidence, and turned his gaze toward Miss Cora. With a condescending smirk, he asked her where she thought his poor, confused wife had been hiding all week. He asked the question loudly, ensuring his bosses heard his performative concern, fully expecting Miss Cora to lower her head and play the role of the ignorant, subservient maid. Miss Cora stopped pouring the coffee. She did not stutter. She did not look away. She slowly set the heavy silver coffee pot down on the table with a deliberate, echoing thud that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The deferential posture she had maintained for years vanished in a heartbeat. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, looking Julian dead in the eye with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. She reached up slowly, untied the pristine white apron she wore over her dress, and let it drop carelessly to the hardwood floor. "She ain't confused, and she sure ain't missing," Miss Cora said. Her voice was a rich, commanding baritone that sliced completely through the pretentious, suffocating atmosphere of the brunch. Before Julian could even process her insolence, Miss Cora reached into the oversized canvas tote bag she always kept nearby. She pulled out a thick, bright red legal folder. With a swift, practiced motion, she slammed it directly onto the center of the dining table. The impact rattled the fine china and violently knocked over Chloe's crystal mimosa glass. The orange liquid spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking rapidly into the expensive fabric and splashing onto Chloe's designer lap. "She has been busy buying the debt to this house," Miss Cora declared, crossing her arms over her chest. Julian's perfectly manicured expression dropped instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The corporate executives sitting around the table stopped chewing, exchanging bewildered, deeply uncomfortable glances. Jamal shifted in his seat, his arrogant posture turning rigid and highly alert. Without waiting for permission or offering any apologies for the spilled drink, Miss Cora unclasped the red folder. She began tossing crisp, heavily stapled document packets onto the empty spaces in front of each guest. She made absolutely sure that Julian's corporate bosses received their copies, first sliding the federal documents right next to their catered breakfast plates. Julian frantically snatched the packet in front of him. He ripped past the cover page, his eyes darting aggressively across the heavy legal jargon. His hands began to tremble, the paper shaking audibly in the quiet room. Inside the packet were not just standard run-of-the-mill divorce papers. There was a deeply comprehensive ironclad frozen asset decree stamped and approved by a federal judge. The decree explicitly detailed the immediate blocking of his access to every single dime he thought he controlled. It listed the joint accounts, the credit lines, and the investment portfolios all legally quarantined. But the most devastating document, sat at the very back of the packet. It was a formal, non-negotiable 24-hour eviction notice. Julian read the words, his lips moving silently, unable to comprehend the reality of his situation. The document explicitly stated that the property he was currently sitting in was owned outright by a blind holding company. A company that Julian now realized, reading the listed guarantor, was entirely controlled by me. He did not own the walls around him. I did not own the roof over his head. He was merely an unwanted defaulting tenant, and his lease had just been violently and permanently terminated. "This is a joke." Julian breathed out, his face draining of all color until he looked physically ill. He dropped the papers onto the table as if they had burned him. "This is a fake. She cannot do this. I am her husband. I have rights to this property." "The federal judge who signed those pages sure thinks she can," Miss Cora replied smoothly, not giving an inch of ground. The realization of his absolute financial and residential ruin hit Julian like a freight train. He gasped for air, his fingers frantically loosening his expensive silk tie, as if it were suddenly choking him. He looked wildly at Jamal, seeking some kind of reassurance. But Jamal was busy reading his own copy of the documents, his face contorting in panic. The corporate executives were quickly skimming the legal decrees, their sharp business minds instantly recognizing the severe liability sitting at the head of their table. The sympathy they held for him just moments ago was rapidly dissolving into cold, calculated corporate distancing. They recognized federal stamps when they saw them. Chloe, finally recovering from the shock of her spilled drink, immediately went on the offensive. Her face twisted into an ugly, entitled sneer. She jumped up from her chair, slamming her hands down onto the wet tablecloth, completely ignoring the gravity of the legal documents in front of her. She relied on the only weapon she had ever known, her unearned privilege. "What is wrong with you?" Chloe screamed, pointing a manicured, shaking finger right at Miss Cora's face. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the high ceilings of my dining room. "You are just the help. How dare you come in here and disrespect my family? Julian, call the police right now and have this insubordinate woman thrown out on the street. She is probably stealing from you." Jamal stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to play the enforcer for his wife and his brother. "You heard her, Cora. Get your things and get out of this house before I have you arrested for trespassing. You have lost your damn mind if you think you can walk in here and threaten us." Miss Cora did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward, nor did she lower her gaze. She had spent decades watching people like Chloe and Jamal belittle those they deemed beneath them, and she was entirely immune to their empty threats. Instead, she looked at Chloe with a mixture of profound pity and absolute undeniable triumph. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across her face, radiating a quiet, dangerous power. "I do not work for you, Miss Cora," said her voice dangerously calm, cutting through Chloe's hysterical screaming. "And I certainly do not work for your husband or his brother. I work for the owner of this property, and the owner has one more message for all of you." The dining room fell completely silent again, the tension wrapping around their throats like a vice. Julian stared at Miss Cora, his breathing shallow and rapid, terrified of what she was going to say next. Jamal slowly backed away from the table, his eyes darting toward the front door. Miss Cora reached deep into the pocket of her uniform dress. She slowly pulled out a small black universal remote control. Without breaking eye contact with Julian, she raised her arm and pointed the remote directly at the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall, just beyond the dining area. The muted morning news broadcast vanished. The massive screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the entire living room with razor-sharp, high-definition security footage. The camera angle was unmistakable. It was a direct elevated view of my master bedroom. The crisp audio kicked in, instantly echoing off the high ceilings and filling the suffocating silence of the dining room. There, projected in brilliant color for everyone to see, was Valerie. She was walking across my hardwood floors wearing my expensive silk robe, holding a glass of my premium red wine. Julian stepped into the frame right behind her. The corporate executive sitting at the table froze. The regional director actually dropped his silver fork, the clatter ringing out against his china plate. They had just spent the last 45 minutes listening to Julian give a tearful, heartbroken speech about how much he missed his deeply ill missing wife. Now they were watching him pull another woman into his arms in his marital bed. The audio feed was flawless. Julian's voice boomed through the living room speakers, dripping with malice and completely devoid of any grief. The executives listened in absolute horror as Julian laughed, telling Valerie how pathetic I looked shivering on the curb at the airport. He bragged about abandoning me in the blizzard. He called me dead weight and told his mistress that he finally had the real woman he deserved. Valerie's high-pitched giggles filled the room. The absolute depravity of the scene was undeniable. There was no way to claim this was an old video or a misunderstanding. The timestamp in the bottom corner of the screen clearly displayed the date and time, proving this had happened less than a week ago on the exact night Julian claimed I had tragically wandered off into the storm. Julian sat entirely paralyzed in his dining chair. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw hung open, but no words came out. He was completely trapped in his own web of lies, and his captive audience of corporate bosses was sitting right next to him, watching his entire moral character disintegrate in real time. But Miss Cora was not finished. The video on the screen cut abruptly to a new file. The camera angle shifted to the primary living room feed from day 2 of my absence. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to look away from the television. Jamal and Chloe appeared on the screen. Chloe was marching into the frame holding heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. The crystal-clear audio captured the sound of my late grandmother's seasoned cast-iron skillets clanking together as Chloe carelessly dumped them into the plastic bags. Chloe, sitting at the dining table in real time, let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with sudden terror. She knew exactly what she had said that day, and she knew the microphone had caught every single word. On the 85-inch television, the digital version of Chloe turned to face her husband. Her face was twisted into an ugly, entitled sneer. "Good riddance," she said on the screen, her voice projecting loud and clear for the corporate executives to hear. "I always told Julian she was too ghetto for this neighborhood. She never fit in with our crowd anyway. All this ethnic junk just brings down the property value." The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy and dangerous. The corporate executives were not just disgusted by Julian's blatant infidelity anymore. They were now horrified by the casual, venomous racism spewing from his sister-in-law. In the high-stakes corporate world, this kind of behavior was a massive radioactive liability. They were sitting at a table with a man who abandoned his sick wife and a family that gleefully destroyed her cultural heritage while using racial slurs. Jamal looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stared down at his wet plate, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Chloe was shaking violently. The carefully curated high society image she had spent years building had just been completely annihilated in under 60 seconds. She was exposed as exactly what she was: a bitter racist woman who felt entitled to destroy another woman's property. Miss Cora simply stood at the edge of the dining room, her arms folded across her chest, watching them burn with an expression of absolute tranquil satisfaction. The sheer humiliation finally snapped Julian out of his frozen state. Panic took over his entire body. He let out a desperate guttural shout and lunged out of his chair, scrambling clumsily over the expensive dining furniture. He sprinted across the hardwood floor toward the living room wall, completely abandoning any shred of professional dignity. "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He did not bother looking for the remote control in Miss Cora's hand. He threw his weight against the wall behind the massive television, desperately clawing at the thick black power cord. With a violent jerk, he yanked the cord straight out of the electrical socket. The television screen went instantly black. The audio cut off mid-sentence. But the damage was already permanently done. The silence that followed was worse than the video itself. The executives slowly looked away from the blank screen and turned their cold, calculating stares directly toward Julian. They were men who assessed risk for a living, and looking at the man panting by the wall, they saw a walking public relations disaster. Julian stood there, his chest heaving, his expensive tailored suit wrinkled and out of place. He wiped a hand across his sweating forehead, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He was trying to formulate a lie, trying to piece together a desperate excuse to salvage his promotion and his career. He opened his mouth, raising his hands in a placating gesture toward the regional director. "Listen," Julian stammered, his voice breathless and high. "Let me explain." That was taken out of context. "My wife is very sick. She set this up to make me look bad." Before he could get another pathetic lying word out of his mouth, a sharp electronic ringing pierced the heavy silence. It was Julian's cell phone. The device was resting face up on the mahogany dining table, sitting right next to his spilled coffee and the federal eviction notice. The screen lit up bright and demanding. In his state of sheer panic, Julian scrambled back to the table. His hands were shaking so severely that when he reached down to grab the phone and decline the call, his thumb slipped. Instead of sending the call to voicemail, he accidentally hit the green speaker button. A crisp, deeply professional, and unmistakably stern voice filled the quiet dining room. "Julian," the voice announced, loud enough for every single executive at the table to hear perfectly. "This is the Chief Compliance Officer from corporate headquarters. We have a severe problem. Do not leave your house. Our internal auditors have just flagged a $4 million discrepancy in your vendor logistics accounts, and federal agents are currently sealing your office. My husband abandoned me at the airport during a massive Chicago blizzard while my body was shutting down from a severe medical emergency. He drove away to celebrate his promotion, leaving me freezing on the curb. 7 days later, when I never returned to our suburban home, he casually asked my housekeeper where I had been. Her answer brought him to his knees and completely destroyed his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to turn your heartbreak into absolute justice. I am Maya, 35 years old, and I work as a senior forensic accountant, handling multi-million-dollar corporate audits. Growing up in a hardworking African-American family on the south side of Chicago taught me how to read people, how to survive, and how to build an empire out of absolutely nothing. But apparently, it did not teach me how to read the man I had been married to for 6 years. The freezing wind whipped across the arrivals curb at O'Hare International Airport, cutting straight through my thin wool coat. I was trembling uncontrollably, not just from the negative 10-degree weather, but from a severe lupus flare-up that made my joints lock with excruciating, paralyzing pain. I had just flown back from a grueling 3-day audit in New York, and my body was actively shutting down. Julian, my husband, stood by the open trunk of our luxury SUV. Instead of reaching out to help me, instead of showing even a fraction of basic human decency, he grabbed my single suitcase and dropped it directly into the gray, freezing slush at my feet. "I am not missing my promotion dinner just because you are throwing another one of your episodes," he sneered. His voice dripped with venom as he refused to even look me in the eye. "Take a cab and stop acting like a victim." I stood there frozen, paralyzed by the physical pain radiating through my bones, and the sudden sheer cruelty of his words. This was the man who had stood at an altar and promised to be my partner in sickness and in health. Before I could even process what was happening, Julian slammed the trunk shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and sped off into the blinding white snow without looking back. As the red tail lights disappeared into the blizzard, I saw the distinct silhouette of another woman sitting in the passenger seat of his car, the very car that I had secretly paid the down payment for. I did not fall to my knees. I did not scream or cry or cause a scene. I pulled out my phone with stiff, freezing fingers to call for a ride, only to see a text message light up my screen. Julian's white, terribly entitled sister-in-law who was married to his older brother Jamal. The message read, "Julian told us you are faking sick again to ruin his big night. Do not bother coming to the family dinner. You are not wanted here anyway." Chloe had always hated me. She was the kind of woman who married into a successful black family and somehow thought she was superior to everyone in it. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, my neighborhood upbringing, and my career, dismissing my highly specialized job as just crunching numbers. Jamal, Julian's brother, enabled her behavior completely, always taking her side and treating me like an outsider who had somehow tricked my way into their prestigious, status-obsessed world. They were a family that valued appearances over authenticity, wealth over character, and Julian had slowly morphed into an exact replica of his arrogant brother. Instead of breaking down on the curb, a cold, calculating calm washed over my entire body. The kind of calm that only comes when a woman realizes she has absolutely nothing left to lose. I pulled out my secondary encrypted phone, a strict necessity for a forensic accountant handling highly confidential corporate data. I dialed a private black car service. When the driver asked for my destination, I did not give him the address to the sprawling suburban estate I shared with Julian. I gave him the address to a luxury downtown penthouse, a property I owned completely through a blind LLC that my husband knew absolutely nothing about. During the 40-minute ride into the city, my body slowly began to thaw in the heated leather back seat, but my heart turned completely to ice. My primary phone buzzed in my purse. Julian had sent a picture to our family group chat. It showed him sitting at a high-end steakhouse flanked by his brother Jamal and Chloe, who was holding up a glass of expensive champagne. The caption read, "Hope the cab was not too expensive. Grow up." They were all in on it. They all viewed me as a burden. They thought I was weak because my chronic illness sometimes kept me in bed for days. They thought I was financially dependent because I dressed modestly, drove an older sedan to blend in, and let Julian manage the public face of our finances to stroke his fragile ego. They genuinely believed I was just a quiet, unassuming wife who was lucky to be married to a rising corporate director. They had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. I had been investing silently in tech startups and commercial real estate for over a decade. I had amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed Julian's entire corporate salary, but I kept it hidden because I valued peace and privacy over flashy displays of wealth. I wanted a marriage based on love, not financial leverage. But looking at that photo of them toasting to my abandonment, I realized my humility had been a massive mistake. When I arrived at my penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, breathtaking view of the frozen Chicago skyline. I ignored the beautiful scenery, poured myself a glass of hot water to soothe my throat, opened my encrypted laptop, and accessed the live feed of the security cameras I had secretly installed in my suburban home 3 months prior. I had placed them there when I first noticed strange discrepancies in Julian's corporate logistics accounts, suspecting he might be bringing dangerous work trouble into our home. I never expected the trouble to be his personal life. I watched the screen intently. I expected to see Julian return home alone after his celebratory dinner. Instead, the front door swung open, and Julian walked in with Valerie, a junior marketing manager from his firm. She was laughing loudly, slipping off her designer winter boots, and walking straight into my kitchen as if she owned the place. I watched in absolute silence as Valerie opened my cabinets, poured herself a glass of my expensive red wine, and walked into the master bedroom to drape my custom silk robe over her shoulders. Julian wrapped his arms around her waist, kissing her neck deeply. He actually laughed as he told her how pathetic I looked shivering on the airport curb. She giggled, calling me dead weight and saying he deserved a real woman who could keep up with his fast-paced lifestyle. The sheer audacity of watching another woman in my home wearing my clothes and mocking my chronic illness while my husband agreed with her extinguished any lingering shred of love I had left for him. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, watching the man I had devoted 6 years of my life to completely betray our vows without a single ounce of hesitation. I thought about all the times I had nursed him through the flu, all the times I had quietly paid off his credit card debt before we got married, all the times I had smiled politely while Chloe made underhanded comments at family barbecues. I had shrunk myself to make him feel bigger, and this was my reward. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop. It was a high-priority automated fraud alert from my primary banking institution. Julian was currently attempting to wire $150,000 from our joint savings account to an offshore holding company. He was draining our liquid assets right in front of me, likely to fund a new life with Valerie, or cover up whatever mess he had gotten himself into at work. I thought because my name was not on the primary login dashboard, I would not get notified until the morning. But I am a forensic accountant. Finding hidden money is what I do for a living. Moving it is even easier. Within 30 seconds, utilizing my professional security clearances and private wealth management portals, I executed a series of financial maneuvers that would leave him completely paralyzed. First, I froze the joint account indefinitely, citing suspicious offshore activity, trapping the remaining balance where he could not touch a single cent. Second, I transferred all of my personal assets, properties, and silent investments into an impenetrable blind trust that no divorce lawyer could ever crack. Finally, I locked his access to every single credit line tied to my name, which unfortunately for him was absolutely all of them. He had terrible credit when we met, and I had co-signed for everything, including his precious luxury SUV. 10 minutes later, the security feed showed Julian standing in the kitchen, staring at his phone in a state of absolute breathless panic. He had just tried to order a ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne for Valerie, using a premium delivery app, and his card had been declined. He tried a second card. Declined. He tried a third. Declined. He paced back and forth, running a hand over his face while Valerie watched him from the kitchen island, her smile fading into confusion. He logged into his laptop on the kitchen counter, frantically typing in passwords only to be met with big red error messages, locking him out of every financial safety net he thought he had. My phone lit up with a furious text message from him. "Where the hell is my money, Maya? What did you do to the accounts? Answer me right now." I read the message, took a slow sip of my hot water, and turned my phone completely off. I was not going to argue with him. I was not going to beg for an explanation or demand an apology. I was going to disappear. I was going to let the crushing, deafening silence do the talking while I methodically dismantled his entire existence piece by piece. He wanted me out of his way so badly. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. 7 days of total absence, while I prepared the greatest financial and personal ambush he would ever face. I sat in the dark of my penthouse, listening to the howling wind of the blizzard outside, feeling an overwhelming sense of clarity. For years I had compromised my own peace to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I had tolerated Jamal's arrogance and Chloe's microaggressions because I believed that family required sacrifice. But watching Julian frantically scramble in our kitchen, his true character exposed by a few frozen bank accounts, I realized that my sacrifice had only enabled his cruelty. I closed my laptop, walked into my pristine bedroom, and went to sleep completely unbothered by the storm raging outside or the one I was about to unleash. The color drained instantly from the faces of the corporate executives sitting around my dining table. The heavy silence in the room shattered as chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor. The regional director did not even bother saying a single word of farewell. He grabbed his tailored cashmere coat, signaled to the other executives, and practically sprinted out the front door to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of a federal investigation. Julian sat entirely frozen, his phone still broadcasting the compliance officer's panicked voice into the empty air. Jamal grabbed a hyperventilating Chloe by the arm and dragged her out of the house, leaving Julian completely alone in the ruins of his performative sympathy brunch. But a man like Julian does not simply accept defeat. When you back a narcissist into a corner, they do not surrender. They become a dangerous, unpredictable animal. Within hours of the brunch, Julian liquidated the very last of his hidden cash reserves. The minor offshore accounts I had not managed to legally freeze, and he hired a ruthless, overpriced defense attorney known for completely destroying victims on the witness stand. Julian decided to go on the offensive. He flatly refused to resign from his corporate position. Instead, he and his attorney issued a massive, highly polished press release. Julian stood in front of local news cameras, his face a mask of righteous indignation, and claimed that the security footage broadcast in our home was an elaborate, malicious deepfake. He told the media and his corporate board that I was a bitter, mentally unstable woman who had illegally hacked his smart home network in a fit of paranoid delusion. He painted himself as the devoted victim of a sick, vindictive spouse who was trying to ruin his pristine career because she could not handle the reality of her own declining health. He weaponized my lupus once again, telling reporters that the chronic pain had fractured my grip on reality and driven me to fabricate federal crimes against him. Jamal and Chloe did not stay quiet either. To protect Jamal's own deep complicity in the embezzlement scheme, the couple launched a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign against me online. Chloe used her curated high society social media accounts to spread vile, racist lies to her thousands of followers. She posted tearful videos claiming I was a ghetto scam artist who had manipulated my way into their wealthy, respectable black family. She fabricated stories saying I had a long, hidden history of mental breakdowns and violent outbursts, painting herself as a terrified sister-in-law just trying to protect her family from my supposed wrath. Jamal took the defamation a step further, aiming directly at my livelihood. He targeted my professional integrity as a senior forensic accountant. He started leaking anonymous tips to industry financial blogs suggesting that I was the actual mastermind behind the missing corporate funds. He planted rumors that I was using my high-level accounting clearances to frame my innocent husband and cover up my own financial crimes. The resulting fallout in my professional world was swift and intense. My private high-net-worth clients started calling my encrypted line, their voices laced with panic, deeply worried that their own financial portfolios might be compromised by the scandalous rumors swirling around my name. I calmly answered every single client call. I assured my portfolio managers that my personal life was merely undergoing a hostile corporate restructuring and that their funds remained locked behind impenetrable firewalls. My unwavering confidence settled their nerves, but I knew I could not let this public circus continue. Any other woman might have cracked under the immense weight of a coordinated smear campaign. She might have released a defensive public statement or begged a lawyer to issue cease and desist letters. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear over their desperate lies. I simply sat in the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of my downtown penthouse, sipping my tea, and let them dig their graves much deeper. Every public statement they made, every defamatory post Chloe uploaded, was just adding more fuel to the absolute inferno I was about to rain down on their heads. While they were busy running their mouths to the press and playing the victims on social media, I was running my advanced decryption software. I knew Julian and Jamal were running out of time. The federal compliance auditors were scheduled to completely open the company books on Monday morning. The brothers needed to plug a $4 million hole, and they needed to do it immediately. Late that night, my network security system flagged a highly secure encrypted email bouncing from a private, untraceable server. It was a message from Jamal directly to Julian. To a forensic accountant who specializes in corporate espionage, breaking their amateur encryption took less than 10 minutes. The contents of that email made my blood run cold and then boil with pure, unfiltered anticipation. Julian and Jamal were not just trying to clear their names in the press. They were utilizing their remaining executive leverage at the logistics firm to push through a massive expedited corporate loan. They were attempting to borrow exactly $4.2 million under the guise of an emergency operational expansion for a new warehouse facility. Their plan was as brilliant as it was utterly despicable. They were going to use the parent company's own corporate credit to quietly replace the embezzled funds before the federal compliance auditors arrived. If they managed to secure that commercial loan, the financial discrepancy would completely vanish from the ledger. The federal investigation would stall due to a lack of missing funds, and Julian and Jamal would walk away completely clean. They would successfully launder the money, keep their lucrative jobs, and leave me to face the devastating legal consequences of their highly publicized defamation campaign. Julian thought he had found a brilliant loophole. He thought his corporate connections and his expensive defense attorney would save him from the consequences of his extreme greed. He assumed I was just a scorned wife hiding in the shadows, intimidated by his aggressive public relations spin. He had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of his little corporate bailout plan. He did not know that his desperate attempt to secure that loan had just given me the exact ammunition I needed to step entirely out of the shadows and destroy him in broad daylight. The following morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of the logistics firm headquarters. The bustling corporate lobby was a sea of gray and navy blue suits, but I cut through the crowd wearing a razor-sharp tailored emerald green designer suit that commanded immediate and absolute respect. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, echoing with a quiet, dangerous authority. The head of security, a burly man who knew Julian well and had been instructed to keep me out, stepped into my path at the elevator bank. He held up a thick hand to block my way, his face set in a stern warning. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I calmly opened my leather briefcase and handed him a single notarized legal document. I declared loud enough for the surrounding executives and lobby staff to hear that my private investment firm had officially executed a hostile takeover early that morning and was now the majority shareholder of their parent company. The security chief scanned the document, his face turning completely pale. He immediately lowered his hand, stepped aside, and swiped his keycard to grant me access to the private executive elevator. I took the elevator to the top floor and kicked open the heavy mahogany doors of the emergency board meeting. Julian was standing at the head of the massive conference table, pointing at a projected financial graph. He was mid-sentence in his desperate high-stakes pitch for the $4 million bailout loan. Jamal was sitting right beside him, nodding along like a loyal foot soldier. When Julian saw me standing in the doorway, a smug, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He assumed I was there to play the hysterical, bitter wife he had been describing to the press. He actually opened his mouth to ask security to remove me, assuming the board would view me as a pathetic, unstable disruption. That smirk completely vanished the moment I walked straight up to the center of the table and dropped a 500-page professionally bound forensic audit directly onto the polished wood. The heavy thud of the binder silenced the entire room. I did not yell, I did not cry, I did not mention Valerie the Blizzard or the utter disrespect he had shown me throughout our entire marriage. I simply took the remote control for the projector right out of Julian's frozen hand. I plugged my encrypted flash drive into the boardroom console and pulled up my first slide. For the next 10 minutes, the entire executive board sat in absolute breathless silence as I systematically dismantled my husband's entire career and his freedom. Using a red laser pointer with surgical precision, I guided the chief executive officer and the compliance board through the exact anatomy of the fraud. I displayed the fake vendor invoices on the massive screen, cross-referencing them with the phantom minority-owned businesses Julian and Jamal had fabricated. I explained how they had exploited the company diversity initiatives to bypass standard auditing protocols, a move that made the board members physically cringe in disgust. I put the high-resolution photographs Miss Cora had taken of the black ledger up on the screen. I showed them Julian's own arrogant handwriting detailing the stolen percentages. I traced the routing numbers from the corporate accounts to the offshore holding companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I then showed the board the exact digital timestamps proving that Julian had authorized those fraudulent transfers using his personal executive security credentials. Julian tried to interrupt me. He slammed his hands on the table, his voice high and panicked, claiming that the documents were faked and that I was a disgruntled spouse seeking revenge for his promotion. I silenced him instantly by pulling up the encrypted email he had sent Jamal the night before. I read aloud their desperate plan to use a corporate expansion loan to quietly replace the embezzled $4.2 million before the compliance auditors arrived. The chief financial officer actually gasped out loud. The room grew so quiet you could hear the low hum of the projector. Every single executive at the table stopped looking at my slides and started looking at Julian as if he were a walking, breathing federal prison sentence. Jamal started sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors, realizing there was no way out. The chief executive officer, a severe man who did not tolerate an ounce of corporate liability, stood up from his chair. He looked at Julian and Jamal with pure, unadulterated revulsion. He stated that their employment was terminated immediately effective that very second. He informed them that their lucrative severance packages were permanently revoked, their stock options were seized, and that corporate counsel was turning my comprehensive forensic audit directly over to federal authorities and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Two heavily built corporate security guards entered the boardroom, having been summoned silently by the chief executive officer during my presentation. They moved straight toward Julian and Jamal. Jamal surrendered quietly. His shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as a guard took his arm and guided him toward the exit. But Julian completely lost his mind. As the security guard grabbed Julian by the arms to physically drag him away from the conference table, his pristine corporate facade violently shattered. He thrashed wildly against the guard's grip, his expensive tailored suit tearing at the shoulder seam. He was foaming at the mouth, his face a twisted mask of uncontrollable rage and pure panic. He dug his expensive leather heels into the carpet, fighting the guards with a manic, desperate energy as they pulled him backward. As they dragged him toward the mahogany doors, Julian locked his wild, furious eyes on me. "You think you have won?" "Maya," he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing violently down the executive hallway for everyone to hear. "You think you can just destroy me? I took out a $2 million life insurance policy on you last month, and I forged your signature as the absolute guarantor on all our corporate debt. You are going down with me." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear over the devastating betrayal of my marriage. I stood at the head of that massive mahogany conference table and let my professional expertise do the talking. The heavy thud of my 500-page forensic audit hitting the polished wood had already sucked the oxygen out of the room. I picked up the small black remote control for the overhead projector, plugged my encrypted flash drive into the main console, and clicked the button to bring up my first slide. The wall behind Julian illuminated with a glaring high-definition spreadsheet. The chief executive officer, a severe older man, who had just been listening to Julian pitch a multi-million-dollar corporate loan, frowned deeply. He demanded to know who let me into a restricted executive meeting. I looked directly at him and introduced myself. I did not introduce myself as Julian's grieving, mentally unstable wife. I introduced myself as the senior forensic accountant representing the private investment firm that had officially executed a hostile takeover of their parent company early that morning. I informed the board that as their new majority shareholder, I was legally obligated to present my findings regarding severe internal financial discrepancies. Julian let out a nervous, condescending laugh. He looked around the table at his bosses, trying to maintain his arrogant facade. He told the board to ignore me, claiming that I was having a severe psychological episode due to my chronic illness, and that I had wandered out of my hospital bed. He actually reached out to grab my arm, trying to play the role of the concerned husband, attempting to escort his sick wife out of the building. I stepped back, my emerald green designer suit immaculate, and clicked to the next slide. I told Julian to sit down and be quiet unless he wanted to explain to the federal authorities why his fingerprints were all over a $4 million black hole. For the next 10 minutes, the entire executive board sat in absolute breathless silence as I systematically dismantled my husband's career and his freedom. Using a bright red laser pointer with surgical precision, I guided the chief executive officer and the compliance board through the exact anatomy of the fraud. I displayed the fake vendor invoices on the massive screen. I placed them side by side with the phantom minority-owned businesses that Julian and Jamal had fabricated. I explained in clear, undeniable financial terms how they had exploited the company diversity initiatives to bypass standard auditing protocols. The board members physically winced in disgust at the blatant manipulation of their corporate programs. Julian's face drained of all color. He sank back into his leather executive chair, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a defense. Jamal sat completely frozen next to him, sweat beading on his forehead. I clicked to the third slide. The high-resolution photographs Miss Cora had taken of the black leather ledger filled the screen. The room grew completely silent as I pointed out Julian's own arrogant handwriting, detailing the stolen percentages. I traced the routing numbers from the corporate logistics accounts to the offshore holding companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I then showed the board the exact digital timestamps, proving that Julian had authorized those fraudulent transfers using his personal executive security credentials. Julian slammed his hands onto the table. His voice was high-panicked and desperate. He shouted that the documents were faked, that his home safe had been illegally compromised, and that I was a disgruntled, vindictive spouse seeking revenge because he was leaving me for another woman. He tried to appeal to the male executives in the room, claiming I was just trying to ruin his life out of pure jealousy. I silenced him instantly by pulling up my final slide. It was the encrypted email he had sent Jamal the night before. I read aloud their desperate plan to use the corporate expansion loan they were currently pitching to quietly replace the embezzled $4.2 million before the compliance auditors arrived on Monday. The chief financial officer actually gasped out loud. The realization hit the board members like a physical blow. Julian and Jamal were not just stealing from the company. They were actively trying to trick the board into authorizing a massive corporate loan to cover up a federal crime implicating everyone in the room in a massive money laundering scheme. The chief executive officer stood up from his chair. The vein in his neck was throbbing. He looked at Julian and Jamal with pure, unadulterated revulsion. He did not ask for further explanations. He did not offer them a chance to resign gracefully. He stated that their employment was terminated immediately effective that very second. He informed them that their lucrative severance packages were permanently revoked, their corporate stock options were entirely seized, and that the company legal counsel was turning my comprehensive forensic audit directly over to the federal authorities and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Two heavily built corporate security guards entered the boardroom. The chief executive officer had summoned them silently, using a panic button under his desk during my presentation. They moved straight toward Julian and Jamal. Jamal surrendered quietly. His shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as a guard took his arm and guided him toward the exit. He knew the game was over, but Julian completely lost his mind. As the second security guard grabbed Julian by the arms to physically drag him away from the conference table, his pristine corporate facade violently shattered. He thrashed wildly against the guard's grip. The seam of his expensive tailored suit tore with a loud rip at the shoulder. He was foaming at the mouth, his face a twisted mask of uncontrollable rage and pure panic. He dug his expensive leather heels into the thick boardroom carpet, fighting the guards with a manic, desperate energy as they pulled him backward toward the mahogany doors. The entire executive board watched in horror as the man who had just been pitching a multi-million-dollar loan completely unraveled. As they dragged him toward the exit, Julian locked his wild, furious eyes on me. The mask of the sophisticated corporate director was entirely gone, replaced by the cornered, vicious animal he truly was. "You think you have won?" "Maya," he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing violently down the executive hallway for everyone to hear. "You think you can just destroy me and walk away? I took out a $2 million life insurance policy on you last month. I forged your signature as the absolute guarantor on all our corporate debt. You are going down with me." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his hysterical screaming. The boardroom was left in a state of profound, ringing silence. The executives stared at the closed doors, processing the sheer magnitude of the crimes their former director had just openly confessed to in a fit of rage. I stood calmly at the head of the table, turning off my laser pointer and sliding it neatly into my pocket. Julian thought his final threat would terrify me into backing down. I thought the mention of life insurance fraud and forged debt would make me crumble. He had absolutely no idea that I had already anticipated his final desperate move, and I had saved my most devastating counterattack for his beloved high society charity gala that coming weekend. The annual Black Excellence Charity Gala was the absolute crown jewel of the Chicago social season. It was an exclusive, highly guarded event where the city's most influential and wealthy power players gathered to network, donate, and secure their status. Despite having been publicly humiliated, fired, and currently under active federal investigation, Julian, Jamal, and Chloe managed to crash the event. They had sneaked in through a vendor entrance, desperately working the perimeter of the ballroom, cornering wealthy contacts and practically begging for a backdoor bailout loan before the federal agents could officially close in on them. From my secure vantage point, in the VIP balcony suite overlooking the grand ballroom, I watched them scramble. Chloe was making a complete spectacle of herself. She was bouncing from group to group, aggressively sipping champagne and spreading loud, malicious whispers about me. I watched her perfectly manicured hands wave in the air as she told a group of local investors that I was the one going to federal prison. She painted Julian as the tragic, exhausted victim of a financially abusive, mentally unstable wife who had hacked his accounts out of pure spite. She was working overtime to save her lavish lifestyle, terrified that the impending federal indictments would force her to return to the mediocrity she had tried so hard to escape when she married into Jamal's family. The heavy crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as the string quartet faded out. The master of ceremonies, a highly respected local news anchor, stepped up to the main podium on the grand stage. The ballroom grew quiet as the guests turned their attention to the front. The host tapped the microphone, his deep voice carrying across the massive room. he announced that it was time to formally recognize the evening's highest VIP donor, the completely silent, anonymous benefactor who had personally funded the entire charity event and single-handedly doubled their fundraising goal for the year. The main spotlight swung away from the stage and swept directly up toward the top of the grand sweeping staircase. The towering gold-leafed double doors pulled open. I stepped completely out of the shadows and directly into the blinding, brilliant light. I was no longer the sick, freezing, discarded woman shivering on the slush-covered curb at the airport. I was not the quiet, unassuming wife who wore oversized sweaters and hid her wealth to make her insecure husband feel like a king. I stepped onto the top landing, dripping in a custom floor-length emerald green silk couture gown that fit me like absolute armor. The fabric caught the light with every movement, radiating pure, undeniable power. My natural hair was styled in an intricate, towering crown, and a diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. A physical manifestation of the multi-million-dollar empire I had built with my own two hands. But I did not make this grand entrance alone. Walking right beside me, her arm linked securely through mine as my honored VIP guest was Miss Cora. Miss Cora was not wearing a maid's apron. She was not holding a silver coffee pot or shrinking into the background to make privileged people feel comfortable. She was dressed to the absolute nines in a stunning tailored royal purple gown. Her silver hair, beautifully pressed her chin, held exceptionally high. She looked like royalty. We stood together at the top of the stairs, two black women who had been treated like invisible, disposable garbage by the men currently sweating in the ballroom below us. A collective breathless gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests as we began our slow, deliberate descent down the grand staircase. The crowd naturally parted for us, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly through the center of the ballroom. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute authority. I locked eyes with Julian at the bottom of the stairs. His champagne flute literally slipped from his fingers and shattered against the polished marble floor. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a walking corpse. He realized in that exact horrifying fraction of a second that his wife, the woman he had abandoned in a blizzard and tried to frame for federal embezzlement, was the billionaire's silent benefactor funding the very room he was standing in. Jamal looked like he was going to pass out, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. But Chloe could not handle it. Chloe could not handle being outshined, outmaneuvered, and publicly humiliated by a woman she had constantly degraded and called ghetto. Her deeply ingrained toxic entitlement completely overrode her basic sense of self-preservation. Seething with an uncontrollable, vicious rage, Chloe snatched a full, oversized goblet of dark red wine from a passing waiter's tray. She marched directly into the center aisle, her eyes locked on my emerald gown. She was moving fast, her face twisted into an ugly, bitter snarl. I knew exactly what she was planning to do. She fully intended to walk right up to me, feign a clumsy stumble, and throw the entire glass of dark red wine directly onto my custom dress to humiliate me in front of the entire Chicago elite. It was a petty, desperate high school tactic from a woman who had absolutely nothing left but her own malice. I did not flinch. I did not step back or hide behind security. I let her get within 2 feet of me. As Chloe aggressively swung her arm forward to launch the wine, my hand shot out with the lightning speed and precision of a woman who had spent the last week meticulously dismantling a corporate empire. I caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was like a steel vise. I stopped her arm dead in its tracks. The sudden violent halt of momentum caused the deep red wine to slosh violently over the rim of the crystal goblet, but not a single drop touched my dress. Chloe gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock as she tried to yank her arm away. I did not let go. I stepped directly into her personal space, towering over her in my stilettos. I looked deep into her panicked, furious eyes, letting her feel the absolute crushing weight of my power. I squeezed her wrist. I did not break her bones, but I squeezed just hard enough, just painfully enough to hit the exact nerve bundle in her forearm. Her fingers involuntarily spasmed. The heavy crystal goblet slipped right out of her hand. It plummeted straight down and shattered violently against her own feet. The dark red wine exploded in a massive puddle, completely soaking into her bare ankles and permanently ruining her $1,000 cream-colored designer shoes. Chloe let out a sharp, humiliated shriek, jumping backward into the crowd as the cold wine soaked into her stockings. The surrounding guests backed away from her in absolute disgust, muttering about her atrocious behavior. She looked down at her ruined shoes, her face burning a bright, humiliating crimson, completely exposed as the aggressive, unhinged attacker she truly was. I did not even blink. I released her wrist, stepped smoothly over the shattered glass and the puddle of wine, and kept walking. Miss Cora walked right past her with a satisfied, tranquil smile that absolutely decimated whatever shred of dignity Chloe had left. I walked directly up the steps to the main stage. The gala host, thoroughly intimidated by the sheer gravity of the moment, stepped aside and silently handed me the microphone. I stood at the acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy, influential faces. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I scanned the crowd, panning past the local politicians, the investment bankers, and the charity organizers. I found Julian standing frozen near the back exit, flanked by a terrified Jamal and a soaking wet, humiliated Chloe. I locked eyes with my husband, the man who had laughed while his mistress wore my clothes, the man who had planned to let me freeze to death so he could collect a life insurance payout. I tapped the microphone once. It was time to burn his entire world straight to the ground. I tapped the microphone a second time. The sharp, percussive thud echoed through the concert-grade sound system, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. The sea of wealthy, influential faces stared back at me in absolute, captivated silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or hysterical. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a woman holding all the cards in a very high-stakes game. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice gliding smoothly over the crowd. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Maya. I am the silent benefactor who funded tonight's gala. I am also the senior forensic accountant who just executed a hostile takeover of the parent company, employing 2 men who have been frantically working this room all evening." I raised my hand and pointed directly toward the back exit. I pointed right at Julian and Jamal. I watched as the local politicians and elite investment bankers physically took a step away from my husband and his brother. I informed the crowd that Julian and Jamal had not been pitching them a brilliant new commercial logistics expansion. I told the high society guests that my husband was desperately begging them for a backdoor bailout loan to cover up a $4.2 million federal embezzlement scheme. I announced clearly that both men had been fired in disgrace yesterday morning and that federal agents were actively securing their former corporate offices as we spoke. The collective gasp from the Chicago elite was deafening. The wealthy investors who had just been handing Julian their business cards looked at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. To attempt to defraud this specific crowd was an unforgivable social and financial sin. Jamal looked like he was about to vomit. He stumbled backward, bumping into a cocktail table as the realization of his public ruin settled over him. But stealing corporate funds is just money. I continued pacing slowly across the grand stage. The emerald silk of my gown trailed beautifully behind me, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. Corporate fraud is greedy, but it lacks a certain personal touch. I looked down at Julian. He was shaking his eyes wide with a trapped animal panic. He was completely paralyzed by the exposure. "What Julian did to me was much more intimate," I said, my voice dropping to a colder, sharper tone. I reached into a concealed pocket of my gown and pulled out my encrypted phone. Earlier this evening, I had instructed the Gala audio-visual team to grant my device unrestricted access to the ballroom Bluetooth network. I synced my phone to the master sound system with a single tap. I looked back at the crowd, letting the anticipation build. "My husband loves his luxury vehicle," I explained to the captivated audience. "He loves it so much he forgot that the high-definition dashboard camera automatically uploads its audio logs to the cloud storage account that I personally pay for." I pressed play on my phone screen. The massive ballroom speakers cracked to life. The audio was crystal clear. Every single person in that massive room heard the distinct sound of the SUV engine running and the howling wind of the Chicago blizzard from 7 days ago. Then they heard Julian's voice. The recording played loud and undeniable. Julian was laughing. Then Valerie's high-pitched voice echoed through the room, asking what would happen if I stayed out in the freezing storm. The entire ballroom held its collective breath as Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with absolute malice. If her lupus acts up and she freezes on the curb, I get the $2 million life insurance payout, Julian said on the recording. It solves all our problems. She is nothing but dead weight anyway. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The oxygen was completely sucked out of the room. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men shook their heads in absolute disgust. Julian had just been exposed not only as a thief, but as a monster who actively hoped his chronically ill wife would die in the snow so he could cash out her life insurance to fund his failing shell companies. He was socially, professionally, and morally annihilated in front of every single person who mattered in the city. Julian covered his face with his hands, shrinking against the back wall as the guests around him murmured in shock and outrage. I paused the audio and turned my attention to the woman shivering in her wine-soaked shoes near the back of the room. Chloe had been desperately trying to hide behind Jamal, but I was not going to let her escape the fallout. "Chloe," I called out, my voice ringing with absolute authority. She flinched violently, looking up at me like a deer caught in the headlights. "You have spent the entire night spreading vicious racist lies about my character to protect your precious high society image," I said, projecting my voice so every socialite in her vicinity could hear. "You love to brag to these people about your massive family trust fund. You love to call me ghetto and look down on the very culture you married into." I looked directly at the wealthy women Chloe had been trying to impress all evening. I informed them loudly and clearly that Chloe had absolutely no family money. I revealed that her pristine trust fund, her designer wardrobe, and her entire lavish lifestyle were entirely funded by the money Jamal had been systematically skimming from my personal investment accounts. "She is not a wealthy socialite," I declared. "She is a broke, entitled accessory to federal money laundering, living entirely off the success of the black woman she constantly degrades." Chloe let out a humiliated sob. She covered her face with her hands as the women she had been desperately trying to befriend looked at her like she was the dirt beneath their feet. They physically turned their backs on her, whispering harsh judgments about her stolen clothes and fake prestige. Her entire identity completely shattered into pieces right there on the ballroom floor. Miss Cora stood beside me on the stage, looking down at Chloe with a serene, deeply satisfied smile. The sheer magnitude of his public destruction finally pushed Julian over the edge. The calculated corporate director completely vanished, leaving nothing but a desperate, furious man who had just lost absolutely everything. With a guttural scream of pure, uncontrollable rage, Julian shoved past the disgusted guests. He charged down the center aisle, sprinting directly toward the main stage with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He fully intended to climb those steps and physically attack me in front of hundreds of witnesses. I stood my ground. I held my head high, my posture perfect, completely unbothered by his violent tantrum. I did not even step back as he rushed the stage. Before his expensive leather shoe even touched the first step of the stage, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom burst violently open. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness of the venue, illuminating the massive stained glass windows and casting long dramatic shadows across the marble floor. Heavy boots pounded against the ground as multiple uniformed officers and federal agents flooded into the room. Heavy boots pounded against the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. A dozen uniformed police officers and federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers flooded the elegant space. The sheer force of their entry caused the entire high society crowd to scatter like startled birds, pressing themselves tightly against the silk-draped walls. Julian froze mid-step, his foot hovering just inches above the bottom stair of the main stage. His furious gaze shifted from me to the wall of law enforcement charging directly toward him. He tried to pivot, desperately looking for an exit, but a seasoned federal detective intercepted him with the force of a runaway freight train. The detective grabbed Julian by the collar of his torn designer suit and slammed him violently face first into a towering catered banquet table. Silver platters and crystal champagne flutes crashed to the floor, shattering loudly over the stunned, silent room. Julian gasped for air as his arms were wrenched forcefully behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed through the vast ballroom. The lead detective read him his rights, his voice booming over the lingering silence. He announced that Julian was being placed under immediate federal arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and the reckless endangerment of his wife. Julian thrashed against the table, his cheek pressed firmly into a platter of spilled caviar. He screamed for his brother. He demanded Jamal call their expensive defense attorney, claiming the entire arrest was a massive misunderstanding and that his bitter wife was framing him. The detectives did not even flinch. In fact, 4 more federal agents marched right past Julian struggling on the table. They walked with absolute purpose toward the back exit where Jamal and Chloe were desperately trying to slip away into the coat check area. A female officer firmly grabbed Jamal by the wrist, spinning him around and slapping the cuffs on him in one fluid, practiced motion. She cited him loudly for accessory to fraud and corporate money laundering. Jamal did not fight back. He hung his head, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, knowing the staggering weight of the forensic audit I had handed the authorities was impossible to beat. But Chloe did not go quietly. The moment an officer placed a heavy hand on her bare shoulder, she completely lost her mind. The carefully curated, highly polished facade of the wealthy, cultured socialite evaporated instantly. She began thrashing and kicking wildly, her ruined wine-soaked designer shoes slipping uselessly on the marble floor. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding the officers unhand her, screaming that she was a woman of status and wealth who did not deserve to be treated like a common criminal. When the officers tightened their grip to subdue her flailing arms, her true character bled out for the entire Chicago elite to witness. She launched into a vile, unhinged tantrum, screaming racially charged insults at the black arresting officers and the diverse crowd of wealthy guests who were staring at her in absolute disgust. She yelled that she did not belong with these people, that she was better than the neighborhood her husband came from, and that she was being targeted purely out of jealousy. It was a pathetic, repulsive display of entitlement. The prominent local politicians, the influential investors, and the charity organizers watched in total revulsion. Her reputation in this city was permanently, irrevocably destroyed in a matter of seconds. The officers dragged her backward through the heavy mahogany doors. She was kicking and spitting, her shrieks echoing down the long corridor until they finally threw her into the back of a waiting squad car. I stood on the stage beside Miss Cora, looking down at the absolute wreckage of the people who had tried to discard me in the snow. Miss Cora simply adjusted her royal purple shawl, looking incredibly peaceful. Back inside the ballroom, the detectives hoisted Julian up from the ruined banquet table. His face was smeared with food and sweat, his arrogant pride completely broken. He scanned the crowd of disgusted faces, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He was searching for his lifeline. He screamed out for Valerie. He begged his mistress to step forward and call his legal team, shouting that they needed to secure his offshore funds to post his bail immediately. The sea of wealthy guests parted one last time. Valerie stepped out from the shadows near the grand staircase. She was not crying. She was not rushing to his side to comfort him or profess her undying loyalty. She stood safely behind the broad shoulders of a senior federal agent. In her right hand, she held up a thick, officially stamped legal folder. She looked Julian dead in the eye with a cold, calculating expression that mirrored the very ruthlessness he had taught her. Valerie told him not to bother asking her for a single favor. She announced clearly and confidently so the remaining guests could hear that she had spent her entire afternoon sitting in a federal interrogation room. When the agent showed her the paper trail, and she realized Julian was setting her up to take the fall for his offshore transfers, she chose her own survival over their romance. Valerie informed my husband that she had signed a full, unconditional immunity agreement. She had turned state evidence against him, handing over every password, every secret meeting detail, and every illicit transaction log he had ever shared with her to save herself from a prison sentence. Julian physically buckled. His knees gave out completely. The arresting officers had to haul him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the shattered glass covering the floor. He realized in that agonizing second that his chronically ill wife had entirely outsmarted him. His brother was going to federal prison with him. His sister-in-law had ruined their family name forever, and his loyal mistress had happily sold him to the federal government to save her own skin. The aftermath of the charity gala was a masterclass in swift and surgical precision. When the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung shut behind the federal agents taking my husband and his accomplices away in handcuffs, the air in the room felt lighter than it had in years. I did not stay to answer the frantic questions of the stunned socialites. I simply linked my arm through Miss Cora's, and we walked out the front entrance to a waiting black car, leaving the ruins of Julian's life completely behind us. The next few weeks moved with blinding speed. Julian was placed in a federal holding cell and immediately denied bail. The judge deemed him a severe flight risk, given his documented attempts to wire hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore holding companies during a blizzard. Julian sat in his orange jumpsuit utterly powerless because every single asset he thought he controlled was completely frozen. He tried to hire another aggressive defense attorney, but his retainer checks bounced. He had absolutely zero financial leverage left. I filed the divorce papers the very next morning. There were no lengthy mediation sessions. There were no bitter courtroom battles over who got to keep the luxury vehicles or the suburban house. Julian had no legal standing to fight me. The divorce was finalized strictly on my terms. I stripped him of everything, severing my name from his completely. I walked away from the marriage with my wealth fully intact and my dignity absolute, leaving him with nothing but the impending reality of a federal prison sentence. The financial recovery was just as ruthless and methodical. Using the comprehensive 500-page forensic audit I had handed over to the authorities, along with Valerie's highly detailed testimony as a cooperating state witness, the federal investigators easily cracked the remaining offshore accounts. They quickly located the phantom minority-owned vendors Julian and Jamal had fabricated. The government seized the $4.2 million the brothers had embezzled, returning the stolen corporate funds back to the logistics firm. But my personal pursuit of justice was not quite finished. I directed my private legal team to aggressively go after the personal funds. Jamal had systematically skimmed from my own accounts over the years to fund Chloe's lavish, entitled lifestyle. The state immediately froze Chloe's so-called family trust fund. They traced the fraudulent deposits, proving that her designer wardrobe and her high society status were entirely funded by my hard-earned money. Every single stolen dollar was meticulously extracted from her accounts and transferred directly back into my private blind trust. Chloe was left completely bankrupt. The woman who had sneered at my natural hair and called my cultural art collection ghetto was now facing her own accessory and money laundering charges while living out of a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Her wealthy friends had entirely abandoned her, disgusted by her public racist tantrum and her involvement in federal fraud. Her carefully curated image was reduced to a humiliating cautionary tale. The sprawling suburban house where Julian had mocked my chronic illness and paraded his mistress in my silk robe was now legally and undisputedly mine. The 24-hour eviction notice I had served him stood firm. I hired a crew of professional movers to bag up the remainder of his custom designer suits, his expensive watches, and his golf clubs. I had them toss his belongings into a basic storage unit that he could no longer afford to pay for. I then sold the suburban property for a massive profit, washing my hands of the space that had held so much quiet misery. Julian and Jamal were officially indicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. Because the evidence was so overwhelming, and Valerie had provided the exact transaction logs, the federal prosecutors did not even offer them a plea deal. The brothers were both facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Their arrogant high society empire had completely evaporated into thin air, entirely dismantled by the woman they thought was too weak to fight back. Amidst all the legal chaos, police reports, and corporate restructuring, there was one person who deserved to walk away from this nightmare with absolute grace and luxury. A week after the charity gala, I invited Miss Cora to the executive office of my downtown penthouse. She walked through the heavy glass doors of my office, not wearing her usual starched white housekeeping uniform, but dressed in a beautiful tailored beige linen suit. She looked rested, radiant, and deeply peaceful. I poured us both a cup of imported chamomile tea, and we sat together on the plush velvet sofa, looking out over the quiet Chicago skyline. I looked at this incredible woman who had practically raised me, who had risked her own safety to photograph the physical ledgers in Julian's safe, and I told her that her days of serving ungrateful, arrogant people were officially over forever. I reached onto the glass coffee table and slid a heavy cream-colored envelope across to her. Miss Cora looked at me with a soft, questioning smile before opening the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. It was the official notarized deed to a beautiful, fully paid-off beachfront condominium in sunny Florida. Alongside the deed was a financial portfolio detailing a massive private pension fund I had established exclusively in her name. It was enough money to guarantee that she would never have to lift a finger, scrub a floor, or work another day for the rest of her life. She was entirely financially secure, free to spend her golden years listening to the ocean waves instead of Julian's condescending orders. Miss Cora looked up at me, tears spilling over her eyelashes and tracing down her cheeks. She pulled me into a tight, warm embrace, calling me her sweet girl and thanking me for giving her her life back. I held her hand tightly and told her that she was the one who had helped me reclaim mine. She had been my quiet, fierce protector when my own husband had left me to the wolves. She deserved every single ounce of peace, comfort, and luxury coming her way. With Miss Cora safely relocated to her beautiful new beach house, and my former family members locked securely behind steel bars, the dust finally began to settle. The brutal Chicago winters slowly thawed, melting the ice and snow that had once threatened to freeze me on that airport curb. My lupus went into full remission. Without the crushing daily stress of a toxic, manipulative marriage, my body finally began to heal. Spring brought a fresh start, a clean slate, and a thriving new chapter for my personal and professional life. I thought I had completely closed the book on the men who tried to destroy me. I thought the silence of my peaceful penthouse was the end of the story. But there was one final loose thread left to tie up. One last desperate communication from the man who thought he could leave me in the snow. Exactly 1 year passed since the night the federal agents marched my former husband out of that charity gala. The brutal Chicago winter had returned, wrapping the city in a thick blanket of white snow and freezing winds. But this time, the storm outside held absolutely no power over me. I stood on the heated balcony of my downtown penthouse, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket, holding a warm cup of herbal tea. My lupus had been in complete remission for 11 months. Without the crushing daily stress of a toxic marriage, my body had fully healed. I was healthy, incredibly wealthy, and living a life of absolute unbothered peace. My private investment firm had tripled its revenue. The properties I owned were thriving, and the blind trust I had secured was impenetrable. Chloe was still working a minimum wage retail job on the outskirts of the city, trying to pay off her mounting legal debt. Jamal was serving his sentence in a low-security facility, completely estranged from the high society circles he used to rule. Miss Cora sent me postcards from Florida every week, usually featuring a picture of her drinking a tropical cocktail on her private balcony. Justice had run its course perfectly. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching the snowflakes drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought the book was completely closed on the men who had tried to destroy me. I thought the absolute silence of my beautiful home was the end of the story. Then my encrypted phone began to ring. I stepped back inside the warm penthouse and walked over to the marble kitchen counter. I picked up the device. The caller identification did not show a familiar name or a corporate contact. It flashed a generic automated warning. It was an incoming collect call from an Illinois federal penitentiary. A small knowing smile touched the corners of my mouth. I pressed the button to accept the charges. The automated voice of the prison system prompted the caller to state their name. The voice that came through the speaker was barely recognizable. The smooth, arrogant, sophisticated tone of the corporate director was entirely gone. It was replaced by a small, trembling, broken sound. "Maya, please do not hang up." It was Julian. He sounded exhausted and utterly defeated. The background noise of the federal prison echoed thinly behind his voice. The clanking of metal doors and the dull roar of confined inmates painted a vivid picture of exactly where he was calling from. He had been locked in a small concrete cell for a year, completely stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his inflated ego. I did not say a single word. I simply stood in my immaculate kitchen, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to speak into the void. Maya, I know you have every right to hate me, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine desperation. But I have absolutely no one else to call. The public defender they assigned me for my appeal is useless. Jamal will not speak to me. My former colleagues have blocked my number. Valerie will not even acknowledge my existence. I am completely alone in here. I took a ragged breath, sounding like a man who is drowning. I just need a small loan, Julian begged. Just a fraction of the funds you froze. Just enough to hire a real appellate lawyer. I cannot survive 15 years in this place. I will do whatever you want. I will sign any confession you need. Please, Maya. You are the only person who can help me. I am freezing in here. I stood there listening to the man who had deliberately abandoned me on a slush-covered curb while my body was shutting down. I listened to the man who had laughed with his mistress about my chronic illness. The man who had actively hoped I would die in the snow so he could collect a $2 million life insurance payout to fund his corporate crimes. He was now begging for my mercy, asking for my financial protection, and complaining about the cold. I looked around my beautiful, quiet, luxurious home. I thought about the sheer strength it took to build my empire and the absolute clarity I had found the moment I realized my own worth. I let him beg for exactly 3 seconds. I took another slow, calm sip of my warm tea. I looked out the massive glass windows at the beautiful, freezing city below. Try Uber, I said. I pressed the red button on the screen and disconnected the call. I did not wait to hear his reaction. I immediately opened the phone settings and permanently blocked the federal penitentiary routing number. I deleted the call log, set the phone face down on the marble counter, and walked back into the warmth of my living room. There was no grand explosion. There was no screaming match or lingering bitterness. The ultimate revenge was not just watching his absolute ruin. It was the profound, unshakable realization that his suffering no longer mattered to me at all. He was entirely erased from my reality. I sat down on my plush velvet sofa, pulled the cashmere blanket over my legs, and picked up a book I had been meaning to read. The storm outside continued to rage over the city, burying the streets in ice and snow. But inside, I was perfectly safe, completely secure, and entirely free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation and build your own peace from the ground up, let me know your experience in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your power and refusing to be a victim. Remember that your worth is never determined by the people who try to leave you behind. Sometimes the greatest closure you will ever get is simply locking the door and throwing away the key. The profound lesson extracted from Maya's grueling yet triumphant journey is the undeniable power of self-reliance, financial independence, and the absolute necessity of establishing unbreakable boundaries. For years, Maya compromised her internal peace and dimmed her brilliance to maintain the illusion of a successful marriage. She silently tolerated the blatant disrespect from her husband Julian and endured the toxic entitlement of his relatives Jamal and Chloe. However, the ultimate betrayal, being abandoned in a freezing blizzard during a severe medical crisis, served as a brutal but necessary awakening. It proved that shrinking yourself to accommodate the fragile egos of manipulative individuals will never earn their genuine respect or love. It only enables their escalating cruelty. This narrative profoundly teaches us that financial autonomy and professional expertise are far more than mere career achievements. They are critical shields against exploitation. Because Maya silently built her own wealth and mastered her craft as a forensic accountant, she transformed from a vulnerable target into an untouchable force. When Julian attempted to ruin her life, steal her assets, and frame her for his own corporate crimes, her meticulous preparation allowed her to dismantle his entire existence seamlessly. Furthermore, the story radically redefines the true meaning of family and loyalty. Marital vows and societal status mean nothing without mutual respect and care. Real allegiance was found in her housekeeper, Miss Cora, who bravely stood by Maya's side when her own husband left her to freeze. Ultimately, we learn that walking away from toxic environments isn't a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate display of strength. True justice is about reclaiming your absolute peace, fiercely protecting your hard-earned assets and refusing to let anyone diminish your inherent worth ever again. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship and rebuild your peace on your own terms, share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys.